Thomas Jefferson. He's one of America's most essential and, well, let's be honest, one of its most complicated founding figures. I mean, the guy was a philosopher, a president, an architect, a scientist, the list goes on. But he was also a man of some huge contradictions. So how are we supposed to make sense of a man who was both a total visionary and, in many ways, a hypocrite? Let's try to unpack that. You know these words. They might be the most powerful and recognizable words in American history, right? The very foundation of the nation's identity. It's this timeless vision of human rights penned by a man whose own life would really complicate its meaning. Because there's another number that's just as crucial to understanding Jefferson. 600. That's roughly how many human beings he enslaved over the course of his lifetime. The man who wrote that all men are created equal was a lifelong enslaver. And that paradox right there is the key to understanding the man himself. To really get this, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the birth of the nation, where Jefferson's role was absolutely pivotal. See, he wasn't a general out on the battlefield. His weapon was his mind, and his battlefield was the written page. So, it's 1776, and at just 33 years old, Jefferson is one of the youngest guys at the Second Continental Congress. He gets put on this powerhouse committee tasked with drafting a Declaration of Independence. And it was actually his friend and future rival, John Adams, who really pushed for Jefferson to write the first draft. He said Jefferson had a peculiar felicity of expression, which is just a fancy way of saying he was a really, really good writer. And this is where things get really complicated, right from the get-go. In his first draft, Jefferson actually included this fiery passage that condemned King George for forcing the slave trade on the colonies. But to get everyone on board for independence, that part got cut. The southern colonies, whose entire economies were built on enslaved labor, just wouldn't sign it otherwise. It was a massive compromise at the very start, one that would haunt the country for generations. So independence is won, and Jefferson eventually becomes the third president of the United States. And he has this grand vision for America. He called it an empire of liberty, a nation of independent, small farmers stretching all the way across the continent. And, his resume before becoming president was incredible. He'd been governor of Virginia, a diplomat in Paris, the very first Secretary of State under George Washington, and then vice president under John Adams. By the time he took that oath of office in 1801, pretty much nobody understood the new government better than he did. Now, one of the biggest moments of his presidency, a moment that would totally reshape the nation, came down to a single number: $15 million. In 1803, Jefferson's team struck a deal with Napoleon in France that would change the map of America forever. And here's what that $15 million got them: the Louisiana Purchase. It was one of the greatest land deals in history. It literally doubled the size of the United States overnight. Just like that. And it kicked off a century of westward expansion into all this new territory. So, what exactly had Jefferson just thought? Well, Jefferson being Jefferson, the scientist, the planner, he wanted to find out right away. He tasked his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark to lead what we now know as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. It was part scientific discovery, part diplomatic mission, and part business trip, all rolled into one epic journey. But as this empire of liberty was growing, that shadow of slavery just kept getting longer. And during his presidency, Jefferson did take a pretty big step. In 1807, he signed a law that banned the importation of enslaved people from other countries. Now, it didn't end slavery inside the U.S., not by a long shot, but it was a major move against the international trade he had criticized decades before. After his time in office, Jefferson went back home to his estate, Monticello. But retirement for him didn't mean slowing down. Nope. He just shifted his focus to building things that he believed would protect the future of the country, things built on knowledge and reason. And his absolute pride and joy was the founding of the University of Virginia, which he called his academical village. You have to understand, this was a totally radical idea back then. He intentionally put a library, the rotunda, right at the center of the university, not a chapel. His vision was for a place where human reason and education, not religious doctrine, would be the foundation of learning. That's how you'd create the smart citizens a republic needs to survive. These were the last words spoken by John Adams. And you can't really talk about Jefferson without talking about Adams. They were friends, then bitter political enemies, and then, amazingly, friends again in their old age, writing letters back and forth for years. Adams, on his deathbed, was certain his old friend was still alive.
Except he was wrong. In what has to be one of the most unbelievable coincidences in all of history, Jefferson had actually died just a few hours earlier that very same day. These two titans of the American Revolution both passed away on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. You can't make this stuff up.
Which brings us right back where we started, to that big unresolved paradox. After this life filled with incredible achievements, we're still left with the fundamental conflict between Jefferson's vision for liberty and the reality of how he lived.
It's like you have two different Jeffersons. On one hand, you've got these incredible ideals. On the other hand, you have the cold, hard facts of his life. He wrote, "All men are created equal," but he enslaved over 600 people. He championed the idea of natural rights, but he profited from the forced labor and even the birth of enslaved children. He spoke out against the international slave trade, but he sold about 110 people himself just to manage his own debts. And, if you look at what people are still reading today, the numbers are pretty telling. The Declaration of Independence is downloaded way, way more than any of his other writings. When you boil it all down, it's his words on liberty that have had this massive global impact, far beyond anything else he ever wrote. That's the part of his legacy that still echoes the loudest. And this whole paradox gets even more personal and complicated. For centuries, there were rumors about Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings, who was not only a woman he enslaved, but also his late wife's half-sister. It wasn't until 1998 that DNA tests pretty much confirmed a genetic link between Jefferson's male line and one of Hemings's sons. It just adds another incredibly complex layer to the story, and it really shines a light on the power dynamics at Monticello. So, after all this, what did Jefferson himself think was most important? Well, he wrote his own epitaph, and this is what he chose to include. But what's really amazing is what he left out. No mention of being president, or vice president, or secretary of state. He defined his own legacy not by the power he had, but by the ideas he felt he gave to the world: political liberty, religious freedom, and the power of education. And that leaves us with the big question, the one we're still wrestling with today. Thomas Jefferson's legacy just isn't simple. He was a champion of liberty and an enslaver. He built a nation on ideals that he himself didn't fully live by. So the question for us isn't whether to remember him, but how. How do we grapple with a figure who was both the architect of American freedom and a product of its greatest failure?